Hi everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the sun today while you revised. What a nice day we've had. I'm just having a look at your comments now as you post them. We'll go properly live in a couple of minutes, so we'll let everybody else join us. But if you do want to start posting your questions as well for me, rather than just your general comments, then I can start looking at what you need my help for specifically. I'm pleased that we are starting at least with our exams now. It seems like it's been a long wait for religious studies exams to start. Not that you ever want exams to start soon, but a lot of you will have already finished a considerable amount of your other exams, if not all your other exams. So it's good to get this one at least started. Fingers crossed for tomorrow morning. Let's hope they're nice to us. But thank you for your questions that you're posting so far. I know 26. It seems like a long slog is still ahead of us. So we still have quite a way to go. So remaining motivated through your revision is going to be a real challenge. So just stick with it. It will be worth it. Am I the guy from Tutor to You? No. Oh, Tom F. That wasn't at me. Hi, everyone. All right, folks, I can see that you've got a considerable amount of questions going on there. So I apologize if I do miss any of your questions. There's only, I'll do my best to answer them all. So let's just start somewhere. Easiest way for us to do this is for me to help you and support you on the general areas. If there's specific topics or content, go back to the teach along later and go over it. So this is more to help you with specific areas of what to expect tomorrow. So tomorrow, just so that you're aware, when you get into that exam hall or exam room, you will have two papers. You will have one paper that has your questions and a book of paper that you will write your answers in. You'll turn the question paper over and you will have 4 questions there. You answer 3 in any order. If there are 2 questions from the same area or 2 questions that are similar, you can do both of them. You can answer any 3 of the 4 and you do them in any order. Do not waste your time rewriting out the question. An examiner will know which question you are answering. So get straight into your answer, straight into your what you want to write. Right, so what's the likelihood of nature of God coming up? Don't think nature of God will come up. It'll be nice if it did. Last year's question was a stinker on Anselm. I mean, that was pretty much the hardest question in the hardest topic they could have asked. But the students did generally very, very well in that. So I don't think nature of God will come up again. You still need to prepare for everything, but I don't think it will be on this year. How do you answer a critically analysed question? You answer that just like any other question. Critically analyse. It's not like other subjects where you change the technique. If it says critically analyse, evaluate, assess, you answer them all exactly the same way, focusing on mainly your evaluation, line of argument. You do not need to change your technique at all, regardless of the question. How many paragraphs do you recommend for an essay? It depends how big your paragraphs are. Most students write about three of the sides of one of the written books. So about 3 sides is about the norm. But as far as how many paragraphs, I normally go for about your intro, with about 4 paragraphs and a conclusion. But it depends how big your paragraphs are. You could do smaller ones, it might work to do bigger ones. So it purely depends on the question as far as how many paragraphs. How do you make sure your evaluation is good? You need to imagine, this is the scenario I've been saying to my students this week, is you need to imagine that what you are discussing is like in a courtroom, the person on the stand, and you're the lawyer questioning them. You're the one looking at everything they're saying. Does it work? Does it not work? So you can make sure evaluation is good by being convincing. Convince me of your argument. What are you trying to argue? Don't forget, everything on my PowerPoint and probably a lot of what you've done with your teacher is content based. That's only going to get you 16 marks out of the 40. It is not even going to be, it'll be just enough to get you a C grade for content. You have to have a line of argument. Your line of argument basically is whose argument is better. Does the argument work or not? Yeah, good luck, everyone. The predictions are on another video that you can find on YouTube. So the video is there, or on the blog, if that helps. Um, Really good question about teleological. Do you separate Hume's criticisms? So he has the 5 in the first argument, then he has the Epicurean hypothesis. I would not put them all in one paragraph, because don't forget, every single time you've put a point, you need to say whether that point works or doesn't work. Every time you put a point from Hume, you have to say how it goes against either Paley or Aquinas. So if by the time you've done that for 5 and the 1, and you've linked it to Paley or Aquinas, and you've evaluated it, that's pretty much a whole essay. So yeah, you couldn't do that in one paragraph. Split up your paragraphs, make it easy for your examiner to read and follow what you're trying to say. Mystical experiences are exactly the same as religious experiences, just got a different definition. So mystical experiences, if the question's on mystical, it means religious experiences. There's no difference. It's just purely mystical, has a slightly different definition, but they're pretty much the same. Psychological effects of religious experiences, Freud, Feuerbach. Psychological means you're psychologist. So Freud and Feuerbach are your psychologists, and they're your critics. William James is obviously a supporter. So you would just work through your psychologist's views, applying them to maybe. So I would do, if I got psychological, I would do Freud and link him to a religious experience of my choice, and whether Freud works or doesn't work is what he's talking about. As far as like Saint Teresa, is it psychological or not? I'd then do Feuerbach. I'd then link it to a religious experience. Does Feuerbach work? William James the same. Don't forget, William James, if you're running out of time, stick with his 4, the ineffable, transience, etc. Link to the 4 and stick with that for William James. And don't forget, William James is supporting it, saying it might be psychological, but it's self-authenticating. It's a benefit. It makes them better people. So at the end of the day, with religious experiences, what you've always got to think about is, does it really matter if it is psychological, if the people have got better because of it, like Nikki Cruz, for example? How much of religious experience and religious language do you need to know? It's 2 areas that have very easy questions they could ask you. Verification has never been asked. Via negative has never been asked. Psychological and physiological critics against religious experience basically has never been asked. They, for me, seem like really obvious areas that they could ask you questions on. But do OCR go with the obvious? No, because the obvious means that I can predict it, and therefore they have to avoid that. So they could ask a question that's been asked previously. They could ask the same question they asked last year. They can do anything they want to. They don't have to equally split between first and second year. They could ask all first year. They never have, but they might just ask one from the second year. They might ask 2 religious language questions. They might ask one on the 20th century and one of the other religious language, and one nature of God, and then one from. They can pick anything they want to ask you, which is why you need to be prepared for any and everything. So what are the chances of both religious language coming up, though? I don't think they'd be that mean. I don't think they would do that, because you've got 11 topics to learn. Asking 2 questions from the same area seems a bit unfair. So I don't think they would. I don't think they'd ask you 2 questions on the same topic either, because you've learned too much and it doesn't show enough, doesn't demonstrate enough knowledge to do that. Do you contrast Aquinas with Wittgenstein? Depends on the question. It's too hot to revise. Yeah, I know it is very warm. If you run out of points to make, leave a gap, go on to the next question because something else might come back to you. If you still can't think of anything and you have time, just rewrite kind of similar to what you've already wrote, just in different evaluative terms to really emphasize your point. Because the more evaluation you do, so often students that don't know a lot of content actually do quite well because then they make loads out of the bit of content they do know. So if you run out of points, just keep evaluating the same things, linking it all back to the argument because it will get you some marks. Can they ask a question specifically on Hare and Mitchell in the 20th century? They could do. I think they'd ask a general falsification, but I think flu came up one year, so they could ask Hare or Mitchell. If they did, you just deal with it exactly like you would a flu question for falsification. Talk about Hare, you compare him to Mitchell and flu and say which argument is better. Can it be falsified or not? Does it still have meaning, even if it can't be falsified? Yep, Slave Boy and Minnow, that sounds really good. That sounds like a really good extended bit of learning there. So, yep. Temporal lobe epilepsy, psychological or physiological? Again, St. Paul, that would be physiological. That's something that's happening with your brain, so that's physical. So even though psychological is the way you think, whereas physiological is the body. So if he did have some sort of epilepsy, that would be, I would say, more physical. 11 only have 9. So you have Plato, Aristotle, theological, cosmological, ontological, problem of evil, religious experience, mind, body, soul, nature of God, to religious experience, to religious language. Sorry, so that's your 11. How do you apply Augustine, Irenaeus, John Hick to evidential and logical? So you won't get the logical argument is the idea that God's attributes logically don't go together. How can God be all loving and powerful and evil still exist? So logical is the inconsistent triad. It's the idea that it's inconsistent because logically evil shouldn't exist with an all-loving God. Whereas then Augustine and John Hick try to defend God to say this is why an all-loving, all-powerful God can exist with evil. So that's how you'd link them to logical. Evidential just means evidence of evil in the world. So therefore, Augustine justifies evidence of evil as moral evil, what we're doing, because we are seminally present and therefore we are corrupted anyway. And so that's how we have the moral evil. Natural evil is there because we deserve punishment because of breaking his paradise. As far as John Hick, he says it's a test. So natural evil is a test, whereas moral evil is because we are spiritually mature. So that explains why we have the evidence of evil, which is the actual existence of evil, both natural and moral. Hope that helps for that one. A priori, a posteriori. So, easiest way, and someone asked this one earlier that I saw, uh, pick either teleological or cosmological versus ontological. That would be the easiest way to do it. If it says a priori versus a posteriori, I recommend, and a student brought me an essay this week with this one, and they'd wrote at least a page and a half just on a priori and a posteriori. That's a really good approach to do. Use your arguments just to back up what you're saying. But if they ask for a priori, that's using reason to back up your arguments, whereas a posteriori is using senses. You can actually talk about them on their own to say which way is better. You then bring in arguments like teleological to say, actually, when applying senses, such as this argument, it works, versus ontological that uses reason and basically weigh up, turns what your line of argument is, weigh up which one's better, or you could do cosmological. Do not forget, you do not have to cover the whole of the arguments. All you are picking out in cosmological, teleological, ontological are the bits based on senses and reason to make your argument and make your point. So you don't have to tell me all about Paley, all about Aquinas. You don't need to do that. You just need to say how Aquinas uses senses to give you the first, second, and third way. Does that then work or not? So that's what we need from the examiners. You could also do Plato versus Aristotle if you prefer, because obviously Plato's rationalist, Aristotle, so a priori, a posteriori is Aristotle. Yes, if you forget the names of the specific philosophers, just put the argument in anyway. So if you can't remember who's come up with it, don't try and blag it as your own though, because the examiners are going to be people like me that know. So don't try and make out Hume's criticisms of your own, for example. But if you can't remember who says it, still put it in as an argument. That is fine. You don't, if you forget the name, do not worry. But your line of argument is always, if this critic is presenting this problem, so if Dawkins presents a problem, what do you think about that problem? Just because you've presented someone else's weakness is not a valuation. It's a fact. They have presented that problem. You have to say whether that problem works or doesn't work. That's a valuation. Whereas just saying about someone else's criticism is just factual, it's just content. You have to say whether it works or doesn't work. Sorry, just trying to read through. How important is it to add quotes? Quotes show a depth of understanding. So if you can add a quote into an essay, brilliant. If you can't remember quotes, do not worry. The only one quote you have to remember is the ontological quote, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. You will not pass an ontological essay without knowing that quote word for word. Every other quote just adds content. I think it'd be very hard to do a John Hick one though without knowing the made in image, made in likeness. I think it'd be quite hard not to know the Genesis quote there. But quotes just add, like names of books, add understanding and depth. It shows you have an understanding. So they're not make or break though. But if you can learn a few quotes, maybe drop one into an essay, brilliant. If you're using Hume, for example, to evaluate, do you need to evaluate? Yes. So you have to evaluate their evaluation because by you mentioning what Hume says, you're just stating a fact. It's a fact that Hume said that. Yes, it's critical, but it's not your criticism, it's his criticism. So that's just content. That's not evaluation. You have to then evaluate his evaluation to say whether it works or doesn't work. Why is he here? Why is his point valid? Is it valid? Does he affect Aquinas's argument in any way, for example? So you have to evaluate the evaluation if the evaluation has not come from you. Ever come across mixing two topics? And best thing to do is to go exactly through the specification to know exactly what they will ask you. But the only ones where they overlap are things like a priori, a posteriori, but it's on the specification, so it's clear they might ask you that. But very the religious language, they might ask you for Aquinas' symbol and Wittgenstein's language games. That's an overlap. But otherwise, they'll be, or Plato and Aristotle, they might ask for an overlap there. But very rarely do they, or they might ask Hume's criticisms, and you can talk about theological and cosmological. So there are a few overlaps, but they're overlaps you should have already kind of learnt and you will know, and the question will be clear. Yeah, timings are a massive problem for a lot of students. So with your timings, tomorrow you will be under immense stress. You will really feel, for many of you who've already had lots of exams now, you know the stress that you have. You will write extremely quick in 40 minutes. You will have real clarity. 40 minutes to write one essay is actually very hard. 2 hours actually is quite a nice time to write 4 essays. So keep an eye on your time. My best advice is if you are getting to your 40 minutes, write the conclusion. You must start your next question. It is never, ever worth giving another 5 minutes to your first question. Why? Because that first 5 minutes then goes into 10 minutes in your second question, 5 and 5, which then means that you have 30 minutes to answer your last question. So you have to stick to 40, 40, 40. But if you still have lots more to say, just leave a gap. Then if you do find at the end you have more time, go back and add a bit more in. But it is never worth going over the 40. Always write a conclusion as well. You have to bookend your essay. Yes, they can ask 2 questions on the same topic. They've not done it before, but they can do. I doubt it will. I doubt they will though. Yes, sorry, I don't know what I said. Yes, Aquinas's analogy and Wittgenstein's language games. Challenge of evolution definitely could come up. It's a massive area that is on the spec twice. It's on both theological and cosmological and has never been asked. So definitely knowing a few pointers for evolution, knowing about Darwin, HMS Beagle, knowing that it goes to the Galapagos Islands, things like that. So have a quick Wikipedia of evolution. That's a good thing to do tonight. Could you use your own examples? Yes, but it's always good if you use the examples that they've given. So and then yeah, evaluate Maimonides. Maimonides' ship does not work. One of my students, however, this week said a really good point in that the ship doesn't work now because we have so many things to compare it to. But back in the day when Maimonides created the ship argument, it might have been a lot easier to work out what he was saying because there was a lot less things it could have been. Nowadays, there's so many things. So in the context when it was written, it probably did work. Today, it doesn't work. But you certainly can always add in your own examples. Add in your own examples for ontological, for example, about something that's better in reality than in your mind alone and things. So your own examples are always very good as well. But if there is an example that somebody gives in the textbook, it's always good to add that in as well because it shows you've learned the content. But evaluating it even better because then you get a double whammy, you get content and evaluation. If a question, thank you, Lee, that's a good question. If you got a question that said evaluate Augustine's Theodicy, would you just stick to him? I personally would. If they want Augustine, they don't want Hick. If they want, if the examiners, this is for any question, if they want something, give them what they ask for. Don't be a politician and give them everything else. Give them what they ask for. So if they ask for religious experiences, psychological, physiological, give them what they ask for. So for me, because there's so much to say about Augustine, by the time you've put out all his arguments, you've maybe linked them to real life cases, you've maybe done a little bit of synoptic links to Augustine from DCT, and you've evaluated all of that. I think that's enough for 40 minutes. If you do want to bring in a bit of somebody else like John Hick, make sure you don't put a whole paragraph on another person. You must do short bits that interweave with Augustine, otherwise it's not relevant to the question at all. So yeah, great question was that one. Flu's logical positivist, yes. How do you evaluate scholars effectively? That's purely based on your line of argument. So do you think what they're saying works or not? So do you actually think they're good points or not? So you evaluate them by that's you after 2 years of philosophy being able to say whether you think they work or don't work. Yeah, fine, you can say he for God, that's fine. Prime mover, yes. So that's a really good question. Thank you for that one. If you find a question they ask you, like via negativa, is quite short and you don't have a lot of content, you can always then bring in another area to compare it to. But again, don't. So if you did via negativa and you've not covered, you've everything about via negativa you've done, you've mentioned all Maimonides, etc. You've evaluated it all fully. You've still got some time left. Bring in the earlier points that you've made and then compare it to somebody else. Don't start a paragraph with a different name because it's not relevant. Same with Aristotle. You cannot write a question on the prime mover without mentioning the four causes. They go hand in hand together. They're different sides of the same coin. So the prime mover is the one that sustains us through the four causes. So you can't talk about the four causes without the prime mover without the four causes. It's the same as Plato. You cannot talk about the forms without the analogy of the cave, and analogy cave without the forms. So for those, you would need to talk about both areas. Whereas in a lot of other areas, if it asks for Paley, you can just talk about Paley. You don't have to do Aquinas. But if you wanted to add Aquinas in, do Aquinas how he links to Paley. Don't do him. Don't do a paragraph on somebody different. So evaluation is essentially your opinion. Don't put I think though. You need to channel it academically, as in you put a point and you say, so you would still have to use critics, you still would have to use names, but then you need to then say whether that point works. So every time you use a name, you need to evaluate whether that name works or doesn't work. So every time you present a view, a name, an argument, you need to say whether it works or doesn't work. But it's always your line of argument. So it is your opinion. You're the one saying whether Aquinas works or doesn't work. You're the one saying whether language games works or doesn't work. You just use people to, again, like the lawyer, you will bring people onto the stand and then say why their argument works for what you're trying to prove or why their point doesn't work for what you're trying to prove. So it is your opinion on them that you have to justify, but you actually have to use people or arguments to be able to make your points. If you get a question on teleological, I no, do not compare to ontological or cosmological. Absolutely not. If it's teleological, answer teleological. By the time you talked about Paley and Aquinas and Hume's criticisms, you've evaluated it fully. There is no time for cosmological or ontological. They have no relevance at all to teleological. So no, whatever the examiner asks, answer that question. Yeah, you can make synoptic links across. So if you wanted to talk about problem of evil and a religious experience, fabulous. I had a question today about whether a student asked about nature of God and whether you could bring in a bit of problem of evil for the nature of God. Fabulous. Because what examiners want, and this is something that they're testing you on, is a holistic perspective. They don't just want Aquinas cosmological, they want Aquinas, they want Augustine. They want to test that you have a holistic understanding, which means understanding of the course. So you could bring in something from ethics, you could bring in something from Bonhoeffer or gender and society into these essays. If it works, bring anything in, as long as you make it clear how it links to your line of argument and the question you are answering. But no, it shows very, very good understanding when you can link it into other arguments. So that's a good thing to do. Person's version argument, we still talk about other people's versions. So how basically if a question is really specific, it depends. So if you've got a question specifically on Paley, it depends how big their argument is. So for example, I could pretty much write an essay just on Paley with Hume's criticisms directly against Paley, then weighing up whose arguments work and don't work. I probably wouldn't need to bring in Aquinas. You might not be able to do that fully enough for 40 minutes, but if you do bring in other names, you have to make sure you link them to whoever is in the question. So if they're asking very specifically for somebody, that's who they want. So give them who they're asking for. But if you do want to bring in other names, fine, but make sure you are showing how that other name is relevant to the name they are asking you for. It's a bit like if a friend asked you a question and you talk about everybody else and they're like, I just want to know about that person. Give the examiners what they're asking for. It's the easiest way of really getting your top marks. Yes, Flew is a logical positivist. Teleological, can you not say the cosmological ontology better argument? Thank you, Millie. I wouldn't personally, because you're introducing compare into a question. So you could, if you wanted to, but compare questions are the hardest questions to structure. So if you're then bringing in teleological, which is a massive topic, 20 slides long, you're then bringing in bits from another topic that's 20 slides long. I just think it's risky business that I wouldn't want to dabble with ontological, for example, because how would you do the ontological quickly to make your teleological point? I think it's risky. You might, if you've prepared and practiced this and already had a go and your teachers have marked it, give it a go. But I think it's risky is linking teleological to another argument just because of the control. Will there always be a name in the question? No, not necessarily. Critically assess the evidential nature of evil. So they don't always ask a name. How long do, very good question, Sarah. Thank you for that one. How long do you recommend planning for? Not long. 2, maybe 3 minutes max. Because what I've said to my students is as soon as they read the questions, write down immediately the names that come to your brain with the questions. Write on the question sheet, because the only person that gets the question sheet is your teacher. Write down everything you can think of on the sheet, and then use your introduction as like your plan, because your introduction is where you're going to set out your line of argument. Your introduction where you can introduce the names you're going to discuss, or which points are going to work and not work, where you explore the question. You don't need to write a separate plan. Plans help you keep a structured and formalized essay, so they make your writing better. But you also don't want to get carried away with a plan, because if you do 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and 5 minutes for your 3 different essays, that's 15 minutes. That's a lot of time over your overall writing when you get no marks for a plan. Also, make sure you keep your introductions short, 6 lines max. Get on with your good stuff. We don't need your whole life story in an intro. Line of argument, main names, what's the question asking, get on with it. So intros, short. Sorry, what do I think is most likely to come up? Check the predictions PowerPoint. Do you lose marks if you don't have an introduction? You're not starting on a great leg if you don't have an intro. It's like starting a book on chapter 3. For me, an intro and a conclusion, however short, could just be a sentence if you need to for timings. You need an introduction and a conclusion. It is your bookends of your essay. So if you don't have one of the bookends, the books fall down, the essay falls down. You could plan all the questions at the beginning if you wanted to, but again, keep it short, 8 to 10 minutes. It depends. If you write better and quicker when you've planned thoroughly, then do it that way. I just think 10 minutes is 10 minutes worth of marks you're never going to then get, because it's 10 minutes you've then lost from writing an essay. And that's 10 minutes where your last essay, you might only get 30 minutes to write it rather than 40. So I would just do a quick brain splurge on your question sheet. But if you're used to planning it and that's how you've been practicing the past 2 years, do what you feel comfortable with to write the best essays. Mark, is it for an A? We don't know. Don't know what it is for an A. The grade boundaries haven't been decided. Do you always need at least 3 paragraphs? Not always. I've read some fantastic essays that just have 2 paragraphs. They're just big paragraphs, but you don't have to have 3. You can, again, it depends on the question and how you want to do it. Do I recommend doing a paragraph on AO1 at the beginning? No. I recommend line of argument at the start of every paragraph, evaluating every paragraph. Why? Because evaluation is where your money is. Evaluation, you get 24 marks. Don't bore your examiner to death by describing loads of stuff. Again, it's your choice. This is purely my opinions and my approach. But most of the content your teachers, your markers, sorry, have already gone over, is in that your markers are going to be teachers like me. I've marked for the exam board before. Don't bore us to death with loads of description, because evaluation is where you get the marks. So because otherwise, if you do a paragraph on description, you're then going to have to repeat yourself a bit underneath to then evaluate it. Evaluate as you go along. Evaluation, 70% of your essay needs to be evaluation. You need line of argument. You need critical words, convincing, not convincing, persuasive, logical, whatever it might be, you need these words. So I, again, would avoid doing a paragraph of description. Get into your evaluation. If you did a whole essay on evaluation, you'll do better than a whole essay of description. AO1 and AO2. AO1 is description. AO1 is names of books, quotes, anything off my PowerPoints. Probably most of what you covered with your teachers is AO1. AO2 is where you evaluate. It's your line of argument. It's where you say Hume is convincing because, Aquinas is not persuasive because, there are too many fallacies that cannot be overcome because. So your AO2 is where you add in your philosophical brilliance. It's where you add in how you perceive the arguments, and who are more convincing, the critics or the presenters, the religious people, the Christians, or whatever it might be. And so AO2 is where you still get marks for technical terms, you still get marks for scholars and names, but it's about how you have a clear line of argument for and against those people. This is where you do the table tennis match of good point, bad point, good point, bad point. You can layer them as well to say, this is a criticism, but then this could be a defense, but then this defense doesn't work because of this. That's where you get your marks. What is the ontological argument? I don't have time, Emily, sorry, to go through the ontological argument. Check out the teach along. So I have seen your question there, but sorry about that. What's the link between form of the good and the prime mover? Again, you probably want to do some sort of Venn diagram, but just the idea is that they are the sources of things. So source of goodness, source of cause and effect, things like that. How are they the ultimate parts of their arguments? One's based on senses, one's based on reason. So that's how you'd look at those two. Do quotes need to be in speech marks? Yes, if they are a direct quote. If you cannot remember the quote word for word perfect, paraphrase it. So you don't, so only put them in quotation marks if you know it is a direct word for word perfect quote. Quotes can be very, very short as well. So, for example, for Plato, as I always say to my students, underground den is a quote. So it's two words, but it's still a quote. So quotes can be very short, or they can be longer. So yeah, use quotation marks if you know it's a direct quote. If you're a bit unsure of the wording, leave it out of quotation marks. Do you have to talk about the hierarchy of forms? If the question is on Plato's forms, I would add in the hierarchy of forms, yes. Because again, I'd have that as a whole theme that I would discuss as part of his forms. Yeah, the prime mover is not God. Aristotle did not talk of the Christian God at all. The prime mover is not God. If you've got religious language is meaningless, do 2 from section 1 and 2 from section 2. 1 and 3. My panic there, Emma, would be you're doing 4 arguments. That seems way too much for religious language is meaningless. For me, I'd do 2. And so you could do 1 from each. But if it was religious language is meaningless, I would personally do language games, and I'd probably do via negativa or language games and verification, just because I really like language games. I think language games is an awesome argument. So I would do language games, because by the time you've gone into the depth, what you don't want to do is do a sweep view of loads of arguments with never any depth. It's better to do fewer arguments in far more evaluative comparative detail than trying to get round through 4 arguments, because 4 arguments in 40 minutes means you're doing them basically 10 minutes a piece with a bit of it's too much. So a bit like religious experience, never go more than 3 examples. Stick with 3. It's better to do fewer in more detail than doing lots of arguments briefly. You have to show depth of understanding. Do I think you can memorize everything tonight? Good luck with that. I'm here for you. Probably not recommended, but you never know if you have a very good brain. AO1 is strictly content. It's not strengths and weaknesses. Then no, strengths and weaknesses is AO2. Corporate experiences are not genuine. Would every AO1 paragraph be content, like examples such as Fatima? Fatima is an example. If you get, thank you for that one, though, that's a really, potentially really good question. If you get a question that has not got a critical tone to it, so like corporate religious experiences are not genuine, you have to, again, your line of argument is they are or are not genuine. That's your line of argument. So I would argue religious experiences are genuine. That would be my line of argument. So then everybody I would present, if I talked about Saint Bernadette, that's just content. But I would then say why her experiences are genuine. I'd use a bit of William James to say why they're genuine, why Freud's criticisms of her not being genuine would not work. That's how you would do it. So every years ago, they asked a question that was something like evaluate the 4 causes. And the students knew that they still had to make a line of argument. So they had to go on town, had to go to town to say whether the 4 causes do or don't work. Every single question, regardless of how it's worded, you have to have a line of argument. Does it work or not work? That's what AO2 is about. AO1, if you're just talking about religious experiences, that's just content. That's just facts. The strengths and weaknesses, whether they work or don't work, is your AO2. 10 leaky buckets is Anthony Flew. So falsification guy. How do you structure an essay if someone's criticisms are effective? You would go through their criticisms. So whatever their criticisms are and say whether they're effective or not. So you'd structure it with their criticisms. If it's just on corporate religious experiences, can you bring in conversion too, etc.? Again, I could write, by the time I've done 3 corporate religious experiences, Whirling Dervish, Toronto Blessing, St. Paul, I've explained why they're corporate. I've outlined the case. I've then evaluated using William James and maybe Freud or Feuerbach why their arguments do or don't work. I wouldn't need to bring in conversion. Don't bring something else in. But you might want to argue that conversion are far more realistic or logical or something than what it's asking for, corporate. So you can, if you want to, but again, be so careful introducing comparison into an essay when they're asked. If they've asked for something, just talk about what they've asked for, because the reason I'm saying avoid comparison. So if they ask for corporate and you start talking about conversion, you have to make sure that conversion is so intertwined with corporate that it's so evaluatively, which is hard to do, you are going to lose marks. If you've done a whole essay on corporate, then you'd stick in a paragraph on conversion. Why? You drop down grade boundaries. Do not do it. So unless you can intertwine it very, very clearly, so this is the same for any argument, if you can intertwine it very clear with what's being asked, do it. Otherwise, avoid comparing to something it doesn't ask you to compare to. Divine omniscience is just a different omniscience argument, so that would be Calvin, Boethius, and Swinburne. Compare question. How do you answer a compare question? Compare, they will always ask you 2 names in the question. Whoever they ask you first in the question is the structure of your essay. So if they ask for Plato and Aristotle, compare. Plato is then the structure. Every paragraph, you need to theme it very closely. With a compare, you're not going to do the whole arguments for both of them because they're asking 2 topics. So you would pick maybe 3 themes from each of the arguments. So forms. So you could do how Plato uses reason, Aristotle uses senses as your first theme of your argument. In every paragraph, you then start with Plato because he's the first name in the question. You would then link in the same paragraph Aristotle to say how he does it this way, he does it this way is better, this way is worse, or this way is better, this way, whatever it might be. That's how you do it. The next paragraph, you go Plato, new theme, link it to another theme of Aristotle. That's the easiest way to compare. Do not just do chunk on one, chunk on another. That is not compare. Compare means you actually need to compare them together. Oh, principle of sufficient reason. Thank you, Zoe. It's a great question. Principle of sufficient reason is a fantastic criticism. Basically, what it means is that there has to be sufficient reason why something has happened, a sufficient reason that the effect. So we're living the effect now. The effect of something has happened. So we're living the effect. So there has to be sufficient reason how this effect has happened. There has to be a sufficient cause for it. So because this effect that we're living now is so fantastic, that we could then say there has to be an even bigger and better cause, and then potentially that could be argued that it's God. You could argue it's Big Bang or whatever. So sufficient reason just means there has to be sufficient reason for how the effect has happened, because the cause is always bigger than the effect. Hope that helps. Yeah, you would get really good marks, Becky, if you went back and forth with lots of arguments, because that's the table tennis. That's the lawyer with the man on the stand, backwards and forwards, because what you're doing then is you're really drilling into that evaluation. So that's really good. If you get a question on religious language, depends what the question is. I've already explained the religious language is meaningless and how to do that one, Millie. If it asks you a specific area, if it asks you a specific area, then you can link it into one other area potentially for comparison. So, but it depends on the question, Millie, for that one. What do I think is most likely to come up again? The PowerPoint has all the predictions. But last year I said John Hicks coming up and he didn't. I don't know how many more years they can't ask you John Hicks, Irenaean theodicy. It's just a massive area. They've never asked cosmological in a second year. They've only asked cosmological in a first year exam. They've never asked verification of via negativa. They've never asked Plato and Aristotle comparison. So my predictions are always basically, here's all the questions that have been asked. Here are all the gaps. Now, do OCR work out the questions from the gaps? Probably not, because it's too predictable. They can't be predictable. But all I'm saying is these are the past questions they might ask you again. These are the areas on the spec they've never asked. Your questions are here somewhere. But for me, I would ask questions that have not been asked before. So check out the predictions PowerPoint though for more specifics. Yes, Aquinas via positive, correct. Yep, natural evil came from the fall according to Augustine. Yep, you'll still get marks for writing the arguments, even if you forgotten their names. So it's better to remember their names, or to better to just have a guess. If you have a feeling, you won't lose marks for getting the wrong name, but you will absolutely get marks still for the arguments as long as you evaluate them. Don't forget to evaluate all the points. Yep, fall of angels. So I'm just looking for the questions. And Plato Aristotle comparison might have been in the AS this year. I don't even know if I even. Yeah, I separate the questions out though. So the predictions I always go with the second year, because even though they ask it in the first year, they can always ask it in the second year. So quite often they ask the same questions in both years. So certainly in ethics, they've asked situation ethics, the AS, and then situation ethics, A2. So again, the papers are written by different people often. So they could ask exactly, the second year paper writers won't necessarily think, oh, it's being asked in the first year, because then you haven't done the first year paper, so they could ask you it. But good point. I don't know what the AS questions were this year. In fairness, we don't do the AS exam in my college, so I haven't actually even looked or seen them. Structure, please go on to the blog. So the blog under the same name, because that will have a lot of essay structures. Again, it's too big of an area for me to go over now. It says the PowerPoint it's on YouTube, so just type in RS predictions and it should come up. Would I agree or disagree with this successive Hume's criticisms? It's totally up to you. You have to pick. I could argue it either way. So I could argue it either way. So you would need to pick which argument you would go down. Just type it into Google. It's under the same name as what I'm on YouTube with. So just type it into Google and it'll come up. Yes, thank you, Alice, for that question. If you take notes in, so if you're under supervised prison, over lunchtime tomorrow, if you've got 2 exams, yeah, you can't access your phone, so you can't access any of the videos or anything like that. Take your notes in, take your class notes in. So it's all, take your flashcards in, take your mind maps in, whatever you've revised from. But yes, you won't be able to have your phone access. You won't be able to access any of the videos in your lunchtime lockdown. Thank you for that question. What principle of sufficient reason best linked to? It easily goes with your teleological and cosmological, because it links back to the idea that there has to be sufficient reason why design is like this, cause and effect is like this, and it could be God. But you could link it to other things as well, like there has to be sufficient reason why we go through the 4 causes. The prime mover is that sufficient reason. So don't forget, the argument is how you use it. So you don't have to say sufficient reason is God and then criticize it. No, if you're saying the sufficient reason and then say how God could be that sufficient reason. So you could use it against lots of different arguments. But yeah, thank you for that one. Hic or Irenaeus. What questions came up last year? Again, the predictions PowerPoint has all the past questions, or there's a separate PowerPoint that has past questions on it. So just check that one out. How is prime mover the telos? Because telos means purpose. The prime mover's only purpose is to sustain through attraction the 4 causes. So it's not aware of us, it's not aware of its telos, but that's the prime mover is therefore the first telos, the first final cause meaning telos, teleological, and so its purpose is to sustain us through cause and effect. How do you decide your line of argument? Imi, I would go through the PowerPoint of all the past questions that's on YouTube and just very quickly in your mind decide, would you go for and against? That's something that hopefully you've developed over the past 2 years, is how to decide a line of argument. So you should hopefully by now know, are you team Hume or are you team Aquinas? Do you think religious experiences hold some merit, or do you think the critics are better? So you, again, it's a good thing to do tonight, is to go through all past questions or potential questions and just very quickly decide, who would you argue for and against? How often should I talk about St. Anselm? Depends on the question. Criticisms against Hume. Again, there's no specific criticisms against Hume as far as names, but you would then criticise whether his criticisms work. So that would be your line of argument, whether you think his criticisms are fair or not. How would you approach Aquinas's first 3 ways question? I would, in each I would do a paragraph in each of his 3 ways and evaluate each of his 3 ways using bits of Hume to say whether his argument does or doesn't work. That's how I would do it. So I'd have 3 big paragraphs, intro and conclusion. That's how I would do Aquinas's 3 ways. Critically assess the nature of mystical experiences, basically critically assess the nature of religious experiences. So you could do anything with that one. You could do William James, you could do examples as the structure of your essay, you could do critics. Mystical just means religious experiences, but know your definition of mystical, because it's slightly different than religious, but it's a bit more specific, but it pretty much means everything off the religious experiences PowerPoint. And then maybe mention someone like F.C. Happel, who talks specifically about mysticism in his book Mysticism. So you could go over the definition of that. Also maybe go over the definition of fallacy. Fallacy just means a mistake in logic. They might drop that into one of your questions, but again, the dictionary definition of that one online is quite good, so it's good to know the word fallacy. Hey, Carmen. Do you need all 3 parables for religious experience? Depends if they ask a falsification question. If they ask a falsification, I don't think they will. I don't think they'll ask falsification, and I'm sure they asked flu last year. I would know them very briefly. So, jungle, lunatic on the university, partisan and stranger. So just know them very briefly. Right, folks, we're 50 minutes in, so I'm not going to have the stamina to be doing this all evening. So if you start getting kind of the final questions out there, things that I can go over, if it's content based, find the other PowerPoints on here to help. Also, I will answer any questions. If you want to put them on different videos, I'm happy to answer them through tonight as well. Yeah, I would revise both religious language topics because language games and verification come up in one, but then via negativa come up in the other. If I was talking about via negativa, because I don't have an awful lot to say, I might do a little bit of language games to compare, but maybe not. I think that if you want to do one and not the other, you're opening yourself up to maybe difficulties in how to write, or at the end of the day, you have 4 questions, you have to answer 3. If they ask 1 question on via negativa and 1 question on religious language, on language games, for example, so I'd be careful which topics you cut out as well. And also physical materialist, physical materialist views. I can't remember the exact wording of it. For body, mind and soul's never been on before as well. Advice on what to do if you get a mental block. Thank you, Becky, for that one. That's a really good question. Just breathe, because it will come back to you. If you start stressing out, if you start putting yourself under immense stress, everything will leave. The best thing to do with a mental block is to go back and read the question. Go back and read the scribbles that you initially put on your paper, and then read your answer again. And so hopefully by doing that, it'll start to reconnect your brain to what you're doing, and you go, oh, that was what I was going to say, and it'll come to you. But it's about just having a breathe, having a moment. Don't panic. It will come back to you. Read the question, read your initial scribbles, and then read your essay, and everything else will come back. But thank you, Becky, for that question. And I hope mind block doesn't happen tomorrow. Yeah, if you misinterpret the question, but you link everything back to the question and your interpretation of the question, yes, you will still get marks. So it's very rare, but the example I give to my students is from DCT. A student once, I asked the question about secular atheist ideologies. Don't panic, it's DCT, it's in 2 weeks' time. But secular atheist ideologies, and they wrote about secularization, Dawkins and Freud. That was completely wrong. Secular atheist ideologies is Marxism and liberation theology. However, that student so meticulously answered the specific question. Everything was linked back to the question. Everything evaluated the question. She got a very, very good marks, because even though she got the wrong topic, she still answered the question from how she read it. So that's fine. However, if the question says psychological and you read it as physiological, game over. If you get those words in your exam, psychological or physiological, for a religious experience, make sure you read it carefully. Make sure you know which word it is. I don't know what AO3 is. Sorry. So I can basically write my own question. Hopefully not. You have to answer. No, you have to. You can. It doesn't always happen. No, you have to answer their specific question. But sometimes what I'm saying is, if very, very rarely you might misinterpret the question and think you've got it spot on, and so you answer it fully, but you've actually talked about a completely different topic. So no, you can't make up your own question, though. Sorry that that's the interpretation you got from that. How do you write an intro? The support on the blog. Specific questions are on the PowerPoint on YouTube. Physiological and psychological. Check out the teach along. I've already answered that comment today under the comments. Of check out the PowerPoint, the teach along. Three agree, three disagree in a paragraph enough for an essay. Three agree and three disagree, I'm guessing, enough for an essay. Yeah, but then you're still sat on the fence. Are you for or against? I'd much rather have 6 bad and 1 little comparison as why they're better. Don't do an equal essay. Who wants an equal essay? That's you need to go hard in on whatever it is you're arguing, whether it's positive or negative. So don't look at doing an equal 3 and 3. So it's better to do 5 and 2. Thank you. Verification. Do you have to use all Hume's criticisms? Depends on the question. If the question is on Hume's criticisms, then yes, you need to use all Hume's criticisms. If it's on Paley, you don't have to use all of them. But again, I think Hume's criticisms are more valuable to Paley than bringing in Aquinas, for example. So, whereas cosmologically he has 2 criticisms. So yes, I would say use both of them then. So it depends on the question. How many evaluation points do I recommend for each paragraph? I'd recommend the whole paragraph being evaluation if you can. The best answers are the ones that have a line of argument and just little bits of content, and everything is evaluated. So again, don't think of it as points. Think of it as creating an essay that is arguing something. I always use this example, and I built into this student a few months ago. Actually, it's a student from about 10 years ago, and I always give this example to my students. And she'd always wrote very half and half essays, sat on the fence. They were always around a C grade. And one day she wrote a Nature of God essay, and it was fantastic. She just went to town on Boethius. She was absolutely arguing. And I said to her, this is brilliant. Where did this come from? And she went, I had a massive row with my mum, I think it was. And she said, so I just took it out on Boethius. And I was like, please have a massive row before your exam. You need to have an argument, but obviously remember there's a line, so never offend anybody, always justify everything. But that's what the examiners want. They don't just want, oh, I've mentioned one strength there and I've mentioned one weakness there. It should flow into your essay. If you are going for the C's, so when you struggle with evaluation, that's brilliant. Even low B's, having strengths in, but to get the A's and the A stars, there needs to be some fluidity in your answer, where your evaluation, don't forget, evaluation is just critical words. So it's where you are. And if you're The line of argument is your best friend. The line of argument is what the argument is for the question. And if you argue that so convincingly you convince your examiner of your line of argument, they are the best essays. Answer the specific question, line of argument, short intro. I've already gone over the logical and evidential earlier. Corporate's religious experience. Good evaluative language, check out the blog. There's one on evaluation and how to create a convincing argument. Yeah, best of luck, everyone. I don't know what the straw man arguments are. Alex, I'm guessing weak arguments or something. I'm not sure. Yeah, so a lot of you asking best evaluative words. Again, there's 2 or 3 blogs on what sort of language to use, but evaluative words is just things like logical, convincing, valid, reliable. These are all words. So basically, feel what you're writing. Do you think Hume is convincing or not? Do you think Aquinas is questionable? Is Paley, you know, is Aristotle talking about something he has no clue on, so just think about, so he has, he's not reliable at all. That Freud, well, don't say Freud smoked cocaine or anything, but took cocaine, but because it's never that a great a weakness against him. But think about the arguments that people are saying, and the critical words will come from there. But there is some blogs to help you. My blog. So type in the name of the channel, the YouTube channel, into Google, and you'll find the blog as well. And there's loads of things on there to help. Hume's criticisms of cosmological. Go to the cosmological teach along. I've already gone over how to structure physiological, psychological earlier, John. It's not great to bring in new evaluation in your conclusion, because you should have already mentioned it in your essay. If it's that good for the conclusion, it should be in your essay. If it's in your conclusion, otherwise it's nowhere, put it in. But if it's in your conclusion, it should be in your essay. What's my cat called? Meggie. She's been very well behaved, actually. Normally she likes fuss when I'm doing these. Right, folks, we're going to round this off shortly. So if you could just ask your final questions, and then you can re-access this live stream later. I'll keep it available on YouTube. So corporate fits in religious experience. Yep, Gilbert Ryle works well for materialism because he's criticising dualists for saying it's they're in the wrong category, but don't call him a materialist. Dawkins and behaviorism are your materialists. They could ask both religious language. Criticism against tillage, check the PowerPoint. I think she's sleeping now, Evie, sorry. Right, that's a great question. Is that one? Is it okay if your handwriting is very bad? No. I mean, it's too late to change your handwriting now. You have to make sure it's legible. If the examiners cannot read your work, you fail. So an examiner, basically what happens is your work is scanned for your markers to read. If your marker can't read it, they send it to their team leader. If the team leader still can't read it, it gets sent to a senior marker. If by the time it gets to the top and it's gone through 4 people that can't mark it, you fail. So you have to, you have to make sure your writing is legible. It has to be able to be read. Can they ask 2 attributes questions? No, they could, but I doubt it. I doubt they'll ask any attributes questions at all. Eternal cop-out, yeah. No, I think that's, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Dawkins says those exact phrases. If you can link it to Dawkins, something on the, I think it's a DCT PowerPoint. Sorry, my brain's, I'm sure he calls it something like a cop-out. It might be in moral principles in DCT, but Dawkins says if you can link it to a person that said it, then you're never offensive. What about typos? Again, Alice, as long as they can work out the word, you won't be penalised for typos, but as long as they know what the word is that you're trying to put. Lily, my predictions are on a PowerPoint on YouTube. How do you challenge questions that are simple, evaluate corporate religious experiences? You would make your own line of, thank you for that, that's a great question. You would make your own line of argument. Do corporate religious experiences work as proof of God or not? Are religious experiences convincing or not? You would create your own line of argument with something like that. You wouldn't just describe corporate. You would then bring in your critics to say whether corporate are, or whether corporate are more convincing than personal or something like that. So you would have to create your own line of argument if there's no line of argument in the question. Why no attributes? Because they asked an attributes last year. They could ask an attributes again, but there's also a lot of areas they've never asked questions on. So that's the only reason. They might ask an attributes question. I hope they do. I think attributes topic is fantastic. And I think that it's a real good one for A's and A-star students to run with. They might ask it on omnibenevolence. Omnibenevolence has never been on before. But just because it was on last year, I'm not thinking they'll ask it again, but they might do this. I believe me, I do not have an examiner's crystal ball. I don't get voices from the examiners telling me what whispering in my ear. So yeah, it's just my feeling, but I might be wrong. Yeah, God is the greatest cop out. I'm sure Dawkins says something very similar to that. What are Hume's criticisms? Look at the teach along. Right, folks. Any last questions? Can you just stick to strengths in your essay? Yes, but it's always nice to give a bit of the other side as well. It's good to have both sides of an argument just to emphasize your strengths more into how the weaknesses can be overcome. That makes an essay a lot better. And plan essays, I've already gone over that earlier in this stream. Omnibenevolence should link it into the other areas. So you just do omniscience and then say whether the everlasting idea of omniscience of God can access time and come in time, whether that shows an all-loving God or not. So you just pick out the little bits from the rest of the topic. If Descartes argues God can do everything logically impossible, then why do we suffer evil? That if God can do everything, we should be able to have free will and not suffer evil. So you just pick out bits from the attributes and work out whether it shows God of love or God of not love. Advice for tonight. Thank you, Mia, for that one. Advice for tonight. I would go onto the BBC News. I would check out what's going on in the world, especially for your example. So check out anything that could remotely be relevant to this exam, because linking it in, or you could do any tabloid newspaper, but look it up on your phone, look it up on Instagram, something like that. So have a look what's going on in the news, because they're good things to mention. I would also go over the little bits that you maybe are unhappy with. Just remind yourself of the certain things. Go over the predictions and the past questions, PowerPoints on YouTube, and make sure you could pick your line of argument for each. Would you be for or against the question? Then check out the blog. I'll tab the stuff to the top that's of relevance, because I might go over something in there that again helps you. So that would be my advice for tonight. And then have an early night, a good sleep, and breakfast in the morning. Make sure you have breakfast, brain food. I've already gone over how to plan with the timings. Please explain Hicks' idea of pluralistic universalism, just that everybody's saved. So Irenaeus didn't believe that, but John Hick just believes that everyone's. Pluralism just means any view. Universalism just means every. So pluralism means all perspectives. Universalism means everyone. So everyone of all perspectives will be saved. That's what that means. Do you have any essay examples? Yes, there's some essay examples on the blog as well. No, Becky, the blog has like about 6 years worth of content. So there's a lot on the blog. It's not a blog, it's the blog. I sound like Anselm, don't I? It's not an island, it's the God. Universalism, part of theodicy, a tiny part, John. It's just a little comparison between him and Irenaeus, in that John Hick believes everyone will be saved, some go through purgatory, whereas Irenaeus believes that a bit like the clay idea, and he says that some people will go to hell. So it's just the idea that John Hick believes that everybody will pass the test eventually, but some need a little bit of post-life help towards the likeness, whereas Irenaeus believes that some will just go to hell. So that's all that is. Um, Larry, it's always good to go with what your teacher says, but when 24 marks out of 40 are for evaluation, 16 marks, certainly the content will help you get at least a C grade, whereas the evaluation will help you move up. Try to do a bit of both, though, would be even better. So even if you just do your line of argument with content, that will get you a C grade. So it might be just the easiest way to do this, whereas if evaluation gets complicated and confusing and things like that. So stick with what your teacher has said because they know how you write and how you work. But try and get in at least a line of argument because that'll help you really solidify at least a C grade. Would they ask a question directly on Irenaeus? Nope, not on the spec. John Hick's reworking of the Irenaean theodicy is what's on the spec. Irenaeus is not on the spec. What are the best examples of religious experience? Look to the last slide of the teach along. I lay out who is best for each of the types of religious experiences. Can you have one-sided? Can you have a one-sided in your introduction? Yes, we want the line of argument. I want to know what you're going to argue in your intro. So yes, that's fine. Yes, always answer specifically. If they ask for Aquinas' fifth way, which is Aquinas' teleological argument, give them it. The reason they'll have lost marks is they'll have done a whole paragraph on Paley with no relevance to Aquinas. If they did Aquinas and then how it linked to Paley and how Paley made Aquinas' argument better, that would have got marks. But I imagine if you stick any paragraph in that's an extra name that you haven't linked to the name in the question, you will lose marks. Right, folks. So we are coming to a close. Good luck with your revision tonight. Good luck with your first exam tomorrow. I will see you this time next week for ethics. So do not forget to. I'll put a. If yeah, I'm trying to work out how to do. If you give me 1 second. Sorry, just trying to find a link. Right. Sorry, my computer's now froze. Too much activity. There. So that's the link to the blog. So that's the link to the blog. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your lovely comments. I'm really pleased I've been able to help you all. Fingers crossed. Good luck. Let me know how it goes as well. Don't forget on any videos, put comments on and I will try and respond tonight. But just don't panic. You've got this 2 years. You've got this show off. Everything you have done for 2 years is tomorrow. If you leave anything out, you won't get marks. So just put everything in. Just answer the question. Just really show off to the examiners and show them how fabulous and wonderful you are because you've worked so hard. So really show off tomorrow and trust that it will come to you. So do some work tonight. Have an earlyish night. Breakfast in morning. Let me know how it goes and I'll be thinking of you all. All right. Bye, everyone.